All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this special time for what I think will be a very engaging and exciting iteration of our webinar series. I will note at the very beginning, before doing any introductions, is that we are going to have this session as well as our past sessions on YouTube. So all of the other sessions prior to this are already recorded and live on our YouTube channel. And for those who weren't able to make this because you're sleeping, hi Ravon, we will have this up by the end of the week for you to watch. But without much more ado, I just want to start off and give an introduction to our two fantastic speakers today. We have Dr. Mark Schira and Dr. Steve Kassem here today, who are a part of the Human Brain Atlas team. And I'm going to stop share really quick so that I can pull up their whole bio that I chatted about. And then I'll go back. Bear with me. Sorry. So I just wanted to make a few notes. So today in this webinar, Mark and Steve are going to introduce us to the Human Brain Atlas project, which is started from collecting in vivo high resolution at 0.25 millimeters. And they delineated about 800 structures, and they're going to introduce us to the detail, this extremely high level of detail that they can reveal in vivo MRI with a specific interest to us on the hippocampus. Dr. Schira completed his doctoral training at the University of Bremen and Charité Hospital in Berlin under a dual appointment. And currently he is a senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong, where he leads his own lab that was founded in 2013. He is responsible for much of the project conceptualization, management, publication, and communication, as well as key data acquisition for the Human Brain Atlas project, and of course, supports the segmentation and delineation of this atlas. Our other fantastic speaker is Dr. Steve Kassim, who completed his doctoral training under dual supervision at the University of Sydney and the University of New South Wales. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow working with Prof Paxinos, and he has brought his novel histological and MRI skills to that lab. He is definitely an emerging leader in brain mapping, and he works directly on the delineations organization of this Human Brain Atlas that they'll be sharing today. And in the first 2 years of his postdoctoral fellowship, already published 2 atlases. So we have really 2 superstars with us today and working on this project. And I hope that all of you will join me also at the end of this, after their presentation, for a very engaging Q&A, because a part of this whole plan is to see, based on what the hippocampal subgroups community is interested in, based on the extremely high resolution that Mark and Steve have developed. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve for screen sharing, and then we'll make sure that Mark has remote access.
Is that coming up, friends?
Yes.
Yes, I can see it. And I need to request remote control. Click to start remote control. All right. Looks like we're all set. Trying something slightly complicated with remote control and stuff. So yeah, thanks, Kelsey, for this lovely introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here and introduce to you guys like our project. So the aim is that we'd like to provide histology grade delineations of the human brain, but for the age of in vivo MRI. So this is all based on in vivo MRI data. This work is basically done at the University of Wollongong and Neura in Sydney. Right, so let's go. Yeah, did it work? Can I progress the slides? No, I cannot.
Always computers, right? Oh, there we go.
There we go. Yeah, that's a problem. I can only go. Beautiful. Thanks, Steve. So an overview of at a glance of our project is we basically kind of do a counter approach to what is typically en vogue. That is big data sets with many participants. We do the opposite. We have a very small number of participants too. But we do lots of data acquisition for these select small number of participants. So it's essentially, you know, when it comes to statistics or accuracy, anything like that, what we're talking about is large amounts of data. And that large amount of data can be collected by either focusing on a large number of participants or by focusing on a small number of participants. So what we get from this is high resolution T1 weighted, T2 weighted, and DWI data sets from 2 volunteers. And each of these data sets is the average of multiple high resolution scans, which are optimized for resolution and signal to noise ratio. And we all resampled them all into a common sort of like template space, what we call it. And that template space has a resolution of 0.25 millimeters. And well, what we aim to do is we provide an anatomical reference for many fields of neuroscience, clinics, and education. And this is sort of where also like 1N approach or 2N approach sort of comes, because if you're looking at like an individual data set, for example, of a patient, you're going to be dealing with 1N and not with 50,000 Ns. Okay, so we have multiple acquisitions at each contrast. So we have 20 T1 scans, 12 T2 scans, and 10 DWI scans. And we basically used a symmetric group-wise normalization from the ANS normalization tools. Our T1 and T2 data were collected using the 7T human magnetome, Siemens magnetome at the Center of Advanced Imaging at the University of Queensland. So our T1 scans were recorded using an MP2 range sequence at original resolution of 0.4 millimeter isotropic, TR of 4,300, TE, I don't think we need to go very much into detail here, but this is sort of like there for your reference if you're interested. Likewise, for the T2 scans, we were using a 3D TSE sequence, again at an original resolution of 0.4 millimeter. And our DWI scans were recorded with 3T scanner, Philips at Shiva, at the Neura Imaging Center here in Sydney. And that used like an inverse blip corrected SBR sequence at a resolution of 1.25 millimeter with only 32 directions but 5 B factor averages and a B val of 1000, a relatively short TE for low distortions, a TR of 3 and some sense acceleration. Now, all these data sets were then basically reconstructed on average into a 0.25 millimeter isotropic template space. So for more details on our methods, you can look at the HBA website, and I'm also going to point a couple of HackMD sites where we have like really detailed scripts of like step by step of all the sort of processing that has been going into that. No, not working. Remote control not working. Yep, there we go. So what we did is essentially a brute force approach. So we averaged many super high resolution scans, and each of these scans was essentially pushed for resolution. Okay, that was quicker than I wanted. And so the reason for that is resolution is much harder to recover in post-processing than signal to noise ratio. You can do that to a certain degree, and I'm going to show you some demonstrations of that. And we did the averaging using the ANT multivariate template fitting tool, which is a bit of enterprise. So we basically ran that stuff on a supercomputer with 256 gigabyte of RAM, 64 CPU cores, and it takes about 4 days for a single iteration. And it's a bit of a painful process because you change small things in your procedure, then give it another go, and then you wait. So you basically kind of have to go remember, what did I do, what did I try, which looks better, what's all the results, and because there's many details that you can sort of like do wrong and right, and like pre-processing. So the first thing that we did is we basically skull stripped the individual images, which you can kind of see here. So this is a single scan at 0.4, and you can see there's a lot of detail in there, but there's also a lot of noise and grain. We did then N for bias correction, and then we basically essentially fed them into the ANTS toolbox. And these steps are critical because sort of like any sort of like information outside of the skull, basically, you know, every sort of template fitting is a compromise between all these different elements, and everything that you remove will not sort of like skew your compromise towards a place that you want to. So it's skull script, but it's not script too aggressively, because otherwise you get some artifacts here at the boundary. It's a bit of a trial and error process, and you know, then we end up with next press bit, please, because I can't.
I think it's about a second delayed. Is it coming? There it goes.
Yep, now it's working. All right, so now this is kind of what I wanted to show you. Let's see the amount of detail that we sort of get out of the sort of like average sort of scan. And a lot of the sort of like the fine structural detail that you can see right about here. Can you see my mouse, by the way? If I'm pointing with a mouse, no, I'm just kind of like thinking you see my mouse, but you don't.
It must be my mouse.
Yeah,
Can you see my mouse?
Yes, yeah, I think everybody's seen your mouse, which is fine. So all the sort of like internal detail structure that is sort of revealed as a consequence of the averaging process is sort of lost in the grain in the other image there. Next slide, please. So here's sort of like, again, a short wrap up of the T1 data set, a bunch of different views of it, showed a little bit of glory. Can you press the button again, Steve? So there is a little video on the side. Again, so this is the average of 20 acquisitions. So who likes a pretty hippocampus? This is what I'm going to go. Next slide, please. And press. Here we go. So here is a bit of like a hippocampus subfield group lovers teaser. So like on the detail, so like what a hippocampus can sort of look like in a T1 image. I guess that's probably one of the things that we sort of found out, that is at super high resolution, the detail in the hippocampus is really quite astounding. So I would sort of say the basic laws of hippocampus imaging is resolution, resolution, and resolution. And if the resolution is good enough, actually T1 images are, I find, actually even better than T2 images, whereas typically the assumption is T2 is better for hippocampus imaging, which is sort of true, but it's also because it's easier to achieve high resolution in T2 scan. Next click, please. Next slide. Okay, so now one back. One back. So this is sort of like our T2 scan, also acquired at 7T. This is only 12 repeated acquisitions, and here's a couple of slides. And you particularly notice so like the detail, so like in subcortical structures, is kind of where the T2 sort of shines. You also see slight amount of inhomogeneities. That's the issue at 7T. In particular, at the cerebellum at the bottom, it looks like we're losing where the image is dark, but essentially we still have lots of image contrast there. It's just contrasting, and we couldn't really overcome that. So if I would basically set the contrast of that image slightly different, you basically see the cerebellum down to the to its very sort of end in fine detail, but you'd sort of lose the top of the brain being sort of like overblown and too bright. And next slide. And video. And so here's a bit of like a show-off slide. I'm seeing some sort of compression artifacts, which is a bit a pity, but you can sort of like see the immense amount of detail. So like that is basically, you can sort of see in these like T2 scans. All right, next one. And so our sort of like final data set I would like to talk about today is like a DWI. That was actually the most painful to process, or the most amount of work. I think it sort of paid off. However, so this was done at a 3T scanner at Neura. due to COVID restrictions, but we were kind of like thinking 70, 3T, with DWI, there is advantages pro and con for both of them. And then sort of like a COVID restriction, basically, well, look, you know, you can't go to Brisbane. So that settled the discussion for us. So we choose to go full throttle on the 3T in Neura, which I'm not regretting at all. I'm very, very happy with the data that we've got. So we acquired the data at 1.25 millimeter isotropic resolution. So that's the original sort of scans, 32 directions, but we get much more sort of directions essentially because we do this protocol 10 times. So we analyzed the data in Matrix. The first and one important thing I can tell everybody who wants first-class DWI images, first thing that you should do is you take your data as you get it off the scanner and you upsample it in plane resolution. So only in the in-plane resolution, not across planes. And then after you've done that in-plane upsampling, feed it into the processing pipelines. Because any processing and essentially results in sort of blurring, averaging, resampling of your data sets, and that amount of blurring depends a lot, or is essentially determined by the resolution at which you're basically resampling it. And if you're resampling it at higher resolution, you introduce less blurring. As a matter of fact, you can actually benefit from the advantages of averaging many sort of slightly offset images and retain actually higher resolution than you originally sort of acquired at. So first thing, upsampling, then you know, a matrix pre-processing pipeline, which consists of FSL distortion, eddy correction, Gibbs correction, and a few other things. And then we basically end up with this DWI image here. And what you can see here, why I put this one up here, is because you can see the high amount of structural information that we basically acquired from these DWI images, which typically, you know, if you look at raw DWI images or even post-processed DWI images, they just look kind of horrible. And they're just all blurry and distorted, but that doesn't have to be like that. And here in this particular situation, it was very, very, very important for us because we need this like high spatial resolution here to apply like a final step of distortion correction, where we used this anatomical image reconstructed from the WI data to align it to the T2 image that we just saw earlier, to basically you know, correct for the tiniest final distortion wherever possible, because we're kind of like stickless for having our stuff aligned as well as possible. And we basically did that again with the known nonlinear distortion correction process implemented in the AMS toolbox in a 0.5 millimeter template space. Can I control now? You are controlling Mark Schira.
Yeah, says you're controlling it now, Mark.
But it's still not working. Next slide, please.
There we go.
All right, so here I want to sort of show off sort of what the super sampling approach can give you. So what you see here on the left is so like our sort of like final DWI FIC image at 0.5 millimeter resolution, and on the right you basically see essentially the same image, but at the sort of like DWI acquisition resolution, which is 1.25 millimeters. And you can clearly see how sort of blocky that 1.25 millimeter image is, and how much sort of like detail and structure you can sort of clearly see in the 0.5 millimeter image, and including quite a bit of detail of the hippocampus, which I sort of like to show off here. Next slide, please. Here we go. So here is pretty much the same story. So this is you know, a sagittal view of the FAC image, and this is purely derived from our DWI data on the left, on the right it's T1, and you can see so like the hippocampus detail that we actually see in our FSC. Next one. Yep, start the fancy videos just for the show, going through the hippocampus. And what I like in particular actually here is the again, some compression artifacts annoying the hell out of me again, is the sort of like the cerebellum, what you can see on the right. And you know, I don't just love the pretty colors, well, I do. So that is obviously also terribly helpful, sort of like for hippocampus, sorry, not for hippocampus, for cerebellum segmentation. I'm sure Steve is quite happy about that. All right, and next one, please. So one of the other things that I particularly obsessed about is like meticulous alignment between like the image modalities at the very end. So here is sort of like a GIF that kind of goes through our different image modalities. So this is a combination of T1 and T2, and you can also see the sharpness in that image. So the green red bit basically highlighting how well aligned they are. So here is a T2. Now it's kind of blending into the FOC. And finally back again to the sort of like T1. All right, next one, please. So, so here's sort of like the final data sets that we kind of sort of have and that we're sort of working with, at least for now. So what you have like the T1, the T2 weighted, the DEC direction encoded, which at the bottom, you know, left obviously, which is a combination actually of the FAC and the T1, which we kind of find particularly helpful and so like in aiding so like our segmentations. And then finally on the at the bottom right, it's a combination which I made by dividing the T1 by the T2 and putting them in different red, green, and blue channels of the division, essentially going into red. And I find the amazing thing is sort of like this sort of like highlights blood vessels quite remarkably. And that's also obviously quite helpful for the segmentation to kind of like avoid sort of distractions and sort of like kind of like, you know, guide, you know, blood vessels from nerves and those sorts of things. And next one, please. Obviously, we do other things, such as we fed the data set into FreeSurfer. It's still not perfect, but it's almost there. Can you go one further, Steve, please? But the thing that I wanted to sort of highlight here is so like how much sort of like gray, how thick sort of the gray matter sort of is, the segmentation. Where sort of gray ends and where white starts is actually not really a big issue for the human eye. You can see this very clearly and very precisely. FreeSurfer automatic segmentation algorithms sort of disagree a little bit, but you can't really do that. Well, you can do it manually, but it's super tedious. Even though it's obvious at every single point, it's just so many points. Next one, please. We also have our data in GSI Studio, and this is just one click of a button, quite frankly. Well, there's a couple of more clicks with importing the data and putting it all right and everything. But this is sort of like the auto tracking feature based on sort of like, you know, too much data from 10 DWI scans. Yeah, I just find it, in particular cerebellum down at the bottom. It's just lovely. And next one, please. One thing that I learned.
Sorry.
One thing that I learned and that sort of surprised me. I'm almost embarrassed to say I wasn't aware what the posterior commissure looks like. So what you see here on the left is like a sagittal cut through the posterior commissure, and you can sort of like see it's like this sort of like hook, like a loop structure. Next one, please. And so this is, and it's all about resolution. So, so this kind of animation kind of flips through different resolutions, always focusing at the posterior commissure here. And, you know, at 1 millimeter, it's just this big thing there. And 0.75, if you wouldn't know, you wouldn't recognize the hook, but at 0.5 and 0.25 millimeter, it's clearly visible that this is sort of hook. And it's kind of like struck me as one of the problems, because, you know, when you're trying to align this data set in ACPC plane, and you're following sort of like normal MRI procedures, you basically, you're kind of used to this big old thing there, and you basically go to the top of that thing. It kind of makes sense, but it's much more complicated all of a sudden. And in histology, that's not really a problem, because you can never choose your plane of cut so accurately. If you're basically close to the ACPC point, you're very, very happy. And in 1 millimeter MRI, you don't see the problem where it is anyway. And all of a sudden, when you're talking at 0.25 millimeter, you see like, oh my God, this is more complicated than I anticipated. What am I going to do now? So we basically defined the PC point is so like at the center of this sort of loop, because it was the most accurate to define the sort of point that we felt, and the middle of the anterior commissure. So this is how we oriented our ACPC plane in our data set. And again, that's sort of like a novel problem I don't think anybody has really come across before. And next one, please. And with this sort of like beautiful picture, I think it's my time to hand over to Steve, true and proper.
Thanks, Mark. I think I can say, because Mark's too modest, that we didn't emphasize, I think, enough, at least from my perspective as the anatomist who does the delineations, how impressed we are with the MRI data. I mean, this is of a resolution, so I'll just bring that back, of a resolution that is starting to approach histology for us. And so as a neuroanatomist that's on board on here, you know, who's more used to histology, we're receiving MRI data in a living human, mind you, because if MRI data we've received before has mostly been post-mortem, within a living human that is approaching a detail that is starting to challenge histology, right, or at least work in tandem with it. And I think what makes this MRI unique, particularly for the Human Brain Atlas team, is that it's our brains. And I think Mark, again, might have been a bit too modest to mention, but Mark and myself, we sat in the MRI machine for about 40 hours, or maybe even more, traveling to and from Brisbane, like he said, which was affected by COVID, and all of this other stuff over the past 3 years, which has, you know, been a challenge, but an enjoyable one. And so it gives us a little bit of an extra sort of surreal effect when we're sort of delineating these brains, because it's our brains. Because where are you going to find a subject that wants to sit in an MRI machine for 40 hours? It's not going to be easy. And just in case I miss this opportunity, Mark will have to jump off, not for anything nefarious, but because he's being taken away by our national broadcaster, because he needs to go on to their show. So I just wanted to make sure we highlighted that before he had a chance to disappear as well. But yes, so we've got these obviously stylized images of how the delineations work in front of us, and Professor Paxinos's you know, very experienced hands with delineations are the ones in the image on the left here. And I was sort of going to gloss over this myself, but Mark pointed it out to me that we really should highlight some of the uniqueness that our lab does with the delineations. And there are other labs internationally that do brain mapping. Like the Allen Brain Institute, for example, does some great work with the genetic maps and some of their cytoarchitectonic maps of the mouse, rat, and you know, they've got some MRI images of the human as well, where they're doing Alzheimer's maps, I believe. But what makes us unique is that we still actually use pencil and tracing paper. And every time we've had someone in the lab and they're like, well, how do we approach the next generation of brain maps? Pencil and tracing paper. Now, you want the right tools for the trade. There's certain pencils we want, certain tracing paper we want, but realistically, that's all it is in its simplest instance is we're observing these contrasts in the case of this brain atlas, and we're delineating them. But it's not as simple as that. It's not like we're just, coloring in by, by number, although it can feel like that sometimes. And Professor Paxinos likes to make that joke. It's obviously a lot more complex than that. And we have multiple professors looking at or at least multiple doctors looking at the each quarter millimeter slide at a time, each one having its fully drawn delineations by pencil first. Pencil being the key factor because we can erase some of our decisions and redraw them based on literature, re-observation, discussion, discourse, and so forth. And we do use a magnifying glass because although we have some of our pictures, set up to A1 and A0, we still, as Mike pointed out, that with the posterior commissure, you want to be able to see some of these changes that are only observable at about 1/4 of a micron. And so you need a magnifying glass. So yes, we do use a divider and a compass like cartographic maps before us, because they are ironically the best tools to use in this scenario. But it goes beyond that as well, which I wanted to highlight on this picture here. Again, stylized a little bit, but not as much because this was just taken on my phone. And I wanted to highlight with people that we actually lay out every single image, or as many as we can, on every flat surface in the lab. So we're talking about 40, 50, 100 square meters of just brain. You can throw your head in any direction and you'll see a slide of the brain. And the reason we do this outside of it, making us feel like we're in a little bit of a wonderland, is it is helpful because working memory is the problem here for us as neuroanatomists trying to delineate this. As we do pencil and tracing paper and erasers because it gives us complete control over what we want to do as quick as possible, we find. But the most limiting factor is actually our working memory. If I asked you to remember the little differences between 10 images alone, just 10, on a computer screen where you had to swipe back and forth between 10 images and keep all 10 within your working memory, you wouldn't be able to. You can't do it with 2 even. And so unless we had 1,000 screens, each showing a different part of the brain, we've found the most efficient way for us is to print them all out, lay them all out, and then that way we can look and follow through, physically follow through, going through each of the slides, and we can trace down through, because these would be coronal slides that we're presenting you today mostly. Well, I will be. We can trace through coronally as we go through the slides, but one structure from start to finish. And we can draw just that one structure on each of those, sometimes 100 images. And then we go back and we try and find another structure that we start at the very front, the most rostral portion, and we follow it all the way through to its most posterior. And then that way we can keep within our working memory, just at a glance, all the little microscopic changes that have happened in this progression. And that's what we argue gives us the most accurate maps. And this has been shown at the last SFN that was in person in 2019, where George Paxinos' maps on the mouse brain were compared blindly and without bias here to the Allen Brain Atlases, and I believe one other institute that does mapping of the mouse, and showed that George's Paxinos' atlases were blindly, when measured, the most accurate based on chemoarchitectonic and other histological measures. And now they are, the fun part of this is that they actually used George Paxinos' atlas from an edition ago. So it was already 5 years older. There'd been a new edition that had come out since then. But it was in this at the conference shown to be the most accurate. And we believe that that accuracy comes from the fact that we can painstakingly take the time and space to lay all these images out and follow each one of the 800 structures, start to finish, with microscopic changes that we can erase when we look at again and again and again. And obviously, it's also rather aesthetic to walk into the lab and, it's 9 o'clock in the morning and you come in and you're just greeted by these beautiful colors all over the place. And we can appreciate, anyone that's got any psychological training, that in and of itself, just seeing those colors will wake us up and make us more pleasant. But onto some of the actual science here. And so I wanted to start sort of top heavy first. We'll go down to some of the meat and how we do it, and then we'll sort of finish on some hippocampal stuff. Here's one of our finished delineations of the coronal slice, 10 millimeters rostral to the anterior commissure. And we've got it here superimposed over the beautiful T1 images Mark's talked about, and adjacent next to the FAC, the beautiful FAC, that were found actually to be one of the most contributing to these delineations, because he's managed to merge them in a way with the T1. And just quickly, it's not an anatomy class, but you can see what I would argue a lot more structural detail in a living human than we've been able to see before in an atlas, in a formal structured atlas. And so you've got almost all the sulci recognized. You've got the cingulate gyrus recognized with the cingulum, so as in the white matter tracts that come out of it. You've got the caudate. You've got a bunch of thalamic structures. You've got the zona incerta. I mean, I won't go through all of them. But where your interest will be, and we'll come back to this in a little bit more focus, is we've got hippocampal structures here. This is sort of at the beginning of the hippocampus. And within the amygdala alone, we're naming about 5, 6, 7 different structures, which oftentimes aren't delineated in histology at all in the human, let alone even in MRI. So that's one of the measures we think really highlights the resolution and its usefulness in delineating the brain. I mean, one of my favorite structures is the claustrum, and it comes out exquisitely in these MRIs, which always fascinates me. And so here it is with all its contrasts sort of separated out so you can see through, and having the diagram that we've made on the far right here, which is what is essentially the final product, superimposed over each of our contrasts, because we do that to correct all of our lines. So we'll superimpose it over T1, T2, FAC, anything else we have, and each one of those superimpositions would arguably modify a line, even if it was only by a millimeter or two. That's what we want to do, and we want it to be the most accurate. And so here's sort of the final product with each of its structures, what you'd see in the final atlas product. The diagram, where it slices through the brain in the red line here, having it superimposed over the FAC, and then having the diagram separate with all its with its complete legend. And as this will be recorded, if you're particularly enthusiastic, you're encouraged to be able to snap this shot, and as long as you reference this, you can continue to use it. As more and more of our diagrams, which we're making, get released online on our website, which Mark pointed out to, I'll give you the link again at the end, where we want to sort of have each of these diagrams uploaded up there when it's fully complete, and allow people to use them, because that's our goal, right? That's our service to the community. And so this is sort of just going over the process of delineation again, and I won't spend too much detail on this. This on the left here is sort of that AC image in one of its earlier states, where it was slightly different, slightly less delineated. And then we have on the right here, one much further down at -26, so 26 microns apart. 26 microns, sorry, behind the AC line. And I've just got them here, to show the jumps that you can see and the change in the delineation we can see, but also just to iterate again that these diagrams are actually just as painstakingly, takes just as much time as the processing of this MRI and of the living human. And that, as I said, we'll have a professor and postdocs look over each slide for days, two days minimum, right? Just drawing sort of the skeleton of this diagram. And then after that, we'll digitize them and then superimpose them and then modify them again and then again and again. And realistically, we won't stop. Ad infinitum, we'll want to have it modified. And that's sort of what each of the editions of the Paxinos Lab atlases represent. But also, as we said at the beginning, in every atlas, and what I'll encourage everyone here that's particularly enthusiastic is give us feedback, give us content. We want it. We're not explicitly hippocampus experts. We're just experts in anatomy and how the different chemoarchitectonic signatures and MRI signatures represent themselves. And if there's something we might have missed, we may have missed it. So just to give you a quick example, in the most recent atlas I was a part of, the chemoarchitectonic of the rat, with the solitary nucleus, we had a joke calling it Sisyphus in the solitary nucleus, because we did it about 45 times just to get it correct. And I was getting quite irate in the end, just like, we did it, it's done, because you've got this piece-sized structure that, you know, it's got about 5 structures within it that we've redrawn about 40 times. You can understand, as the protege to the rather experienced mentor, I was getting a bit annoyed, but it created a good product, obviously. And that's how, again, the labor represents itself in the accuracy. And as the Paxinos lab atlases are the most used, presumably that represents itself in citations as well. And so here, I won't go through this. I was thinking if I had a bit more time, I would. But again, here's 3 more diagrams in their more earlier states, just to show you some of the processes and the level of diagram, dramatic detail, and the jumps in detail that we can follow through. But what I would more like to show you on is this image here. And so we're going to show you 2 images. This is at AC minus 10.5, and then it's going to fade into image minus 11.5. And so I chose these 2 slides in particular because they're within 1.5 millimeters apart. They're only a millimeter apart. And from what I understand, at least, not a clinician or an MRI expert, but a lot of the quick clinical MRI scans you get at the hospital for 15 minutes wouldn't be much better in a living human, which you are, and this atlas is, much better than 1.5 millimeters. And so these diagrams are only a millimeter apart. And if I just flick between these, not too quickly, I mean, even if you're not particularly focused or paying too much attention, you'd be able to see that there's a fair amount of change in this brain structure. Sorry, just in the brain, I should say, and in many of the structures within just a millimeter. One of the ones I'd like to point out is the substantia nigra comes in within a millimeter. And, you know, what's an extra, just down here, if you can see my mouse, well, what's, you know, we would have spotted in 1.5 millimeters. Well, of course you would have. But you add up all those 0.5 millimeters, you're missing 10 millimeters, 20 millimeters in just, lost volume there, where everything starts and finishes, at least, presumably, right? But outside of that, our goal is to be the most accurate. We want it to be clinically used and we want it to be used in education, but we don't want it to necessarily be efficient. We want it to be accurate. And so if we can find out that the substantia nigra starts 0.5 millimeter earlier, hell, if we can find it starts a 1/1000th of a millimeter earlier, we want to find it and we want to delineate it in its most representative state within the living human. What better representation could we have? And again, if it's recorded, you're welcome to sort of see what else changes between these 2 diagrams. You'll see some shifts in borders of Brodmann's area 43, for example, shifts a tiny bit. And throughout in the hippocampus, you can see some changes as well, such as CA1 and CA3 and delineate gyrus are being a bit more delineated between them. And that's only, again, like I said, 1 millimeter apart. And that's our goal. And so because I want enough time for questions, I'll just show you, again, one of the more finished products here. Again, picking this slide for its hippocampal delineation. I've got to cook for your guests. And so we've got, again, superimposed over T1. And again, we've got this would be a much more completed version of our diagrams. And you've got the full list legend here of all the different structures. Again, you're welcome to use this, just cite us, please. It's on our website as well. And we believe some of the delineations that we've got in the hippocampus, which we're going to get closer with, are some of the best you can get. And so just because Mark's beautiful transitioning image here goes through the hippocampus in its sagittal, I just thought I'd wrap up with this again. And so we're transitioning between the contrasts. Mark's pointed out that, all these contrasts are perfectly aligned to each other. These virtual fiduciary marks are perfectly aligned. But this is useful for the anatomist as well, because as it's transitioning, like I said, you sort of get to feel vicariously what it's like superimposing these diagrams, now that you understand them a bit better, over these different contrasts, and how each contrast is going to infer to us different information. Give us different information that allow us to infer different lines of delineation in the brain. And so that's basically what I'm going over there, which is different contrasts Globus pallidus is one of the more obvious ones here. For those not too familiar, it goes a beautiful bright orange in this transition here, and it's obviously quite dark black in T2. And so sort of taking some snips of each of those contrasts there and just putting into this quick collage for us, we can see some of the delineations we've got here. You've got the dentate gyrus. I'm just sort of highlighting this as hippocampus for the time being. We want to obviously delineate this even further, but you can see the fimbria, the alveus, quite clearly. The dentate gyrus comes out a nice richer black. Some of the more obvious color contrasting advantages besides, say, the globus pallidus, for example, or the hippocampus, where you can get the shifting in color, is the optic tract, for example, isn't quite obvious, or even just looks like a sort of a gray blob on a T1 or a T2. But when you've got the FAC involved, you get this beautiful sharp color that indicates to me as an anatomist, that's sort of where the optic tract is. And one thing, just again, for those not too familiar, because it wasn't too familiar with me when I first learned, is that this colorful FAC here and all the FACs we've used previous are indicative of the directions of all these tracks, which is also helpful for us as a delineation, because if we were trying to disambiguate the, just in case I have one here, I'll go through really quick. We don't on this one, but let's say I wanted to delineate between this longitudinal fibers that radiate to the different cortex, longitudinal fiber bundle 1, 2, and 3. You can't really tell them apart on a T1 or a T2, but with FAC, blue meaning up, down, red meaning left, right, and green going in and out of our coronal slice in its most, childish definitions, they tell us, well, a vertical shifting bundle is going to be longitudinal fiber 1, where a more lateral medial shift is going to be indicative of 2, and 3 going more into the corner of the brain, if you will, is going to have a bit, again, a different color to it. So they, again, infer even more information to us. But with that, we've got time. I think I finished went a little bit longer, friends. I got too enthusiastic. Wanted to go over the website again. Please go there, check us out, even if you just want to look at some pretty pictures and you're just an enthusiast. But we've got all our detail, we've got lots of methods there. We've got some delineations up there, lots of beautiful transitions of contrasts and colors, and hopefully more and more as we update it more and more. And hopefully there's no more COVID impairing our ability to do so. There's the 4 of us. There's Professor Paxinos, Mark, myself, and Zoe. God, the mornings for us, right? And Zoe, who's been extraordinarily helpful. And there'll be a bit more information on the rest of our broader team there as well. And even more importantly, most recently, our biggest upload has been our data sets, which even if you don't want to delineate anything and you just want to enjoy it, please have a look. They're within the website itself, so you don't even need to download anything. Have a crack. And again, please, all rights are reserved. So please, again, contact us for use of any of these images, and obviously citations to the website would be very helpful and appreciated. And with that, we're open to discussion. And I want to be transparent with this as well, because we both have limited time, and from what I understand, it's after work in the evening for yourselves. Is we want questions, but ideally as well, what we'd like before we finish is want to know specifically from your team what it is we could do to this data set and this atlas and these delineations to make it so your team would use them. Not just, what's good about this and what's good about that. Well, anyone can say platitudes, friends, but we want to know what it would take from us to make it so your team would use this data set. And with that, thank you very much for listening. And questions ahoy.
Those were some really beautiful images. It was super impressive. I think I've still got like the star eye emoji. If you guys know which one I'm talking about, it's not the hearts, it's the stars. So I'm going to open it up to other people's questions. But before I do that, I just want to put out there that we will take time to have a conversation here, but in our conversations, Mark, Steve, and I think probably the other members of the HSG would be interested too in trying to come out with a poll that we would actually sort of a survey that would go out to the larger group. So if there's something you think of that you don't, you have after work brain or early morning brain, and you can't quite spit it out right now, that there will be an opportunity definitely that will facilitate with Mark and Steve to make sure that even if you, and for the people who weren't able to join live, so after people have watched YouTube, can some feedback so that we can sort of align for everyone to benefit, right? Collaborative science is the best science. And so I think that that's something that all of us would agree with, as our community is all about that. So with that, I'm going to stop rambling. I see someone has undone their camera. So if you'd like to have a question or a chat, feel free.
Can I ask something, or?
Yes, go for it.
Hey, it's really amazing work. So I have one question. So you have shown this beautiful drawing, really impressive. So, and like how the boundaries were informed. I believe that was your brain, right? So there were different cortical areas.
That's right. So, yeah. So again, you know, I could talk about this for an hour if I had the space to. But to be as clear as possible, that's correct. So just using this image, for example, because you can see a superimposition over the data we're using to infer from. The cortical ribbon, for example, is inferred from the T1, the T2, and anything else that can show us the distinctions between white matter and gray matter. And then the boundaries within that cortical ribbon, for example, are actually not just inferred from previous Brodmann's maps. You know, I'm actually doing a paper on how Brodmann needs to be updated, because still using him is like using a 100-year-old calculator. But you know, as impressive as his work is, we've gone beyond Brodmann now. But outside of that, you know, there is also MRI shifts and changes that will be indicative of the different Brodmann's areas that help us infer that, not just previous work. But a lot of the delineation work is in the subcortical structures, where it isn't just sort of a ribbon that's almost arbitrarily cut. It's in the subcortex where you can see these shifts and changes in density. So, I mean, I've got to slow down because I'm too excited, but if we sort of skip back to one of Mark's beautiful images here, in the subcortex alone, you can see the red nucleus is obviously quite rich and dark here. You've got all these little details within the thalamus here. So you've got this little crescent here. You've got all these other little bits and pieces, connecting it and drawing it all up. That's just in the T2. And then we look at the T1, the FAC, and everything else, and we sort of combine them all together.
Okay. So you went through Brodmann maps, and also like it's more semi basically supervised.
Well, the way we describe it is that we're not copying anyone. That's not our business. It's we'll have a Brodmann's atlas. We'll have this atlas I even have on my desk right now. We'll have a bunch of literature, and that group of literature will inform us, as well as what we physically see on the images themselves will inform us. And so just for example, in a previous atlas, everyone else's atlas, in the chemoarchitectonic one I quickly mentioned in the RAD, you know, the cortical ribbon definitions there, just to use the cortex again, even in George's own work. So, you know, I could point fingers at even my mentor, which is always, you know, the joy of the protege, is you got the cortex wrong. Because we saw now in new histological stains that were superimposing over each other, that definitions in the cortex, like certain areas can't have all 5 layers or 6 layers. You know, there's certain just changes in the cortical thickness in certain cortical groups. I mean, that's why we define them as such. Had been incorrectly transferred between a few atlases, his included, because people just copy pasted. And so I went back and painstakingly pulled a 75-year-old man through 400 diagrams of cortex and go, no, we've got to move it over 4 millimeters because we got it wrong. And so that's sort of where we sit, in that, yes, we take inferences from other work, but we're the drivers of it, right? We want it to inform us, not to guide us. We're using the data we see and the understanding of how that data is represented to help draw these lines. I hope that answers your question.
Very well. And so just a follow-up, and did you, like, how well correspondence did you find with the free surfer segmentation? I don't want to take the time from other people, just the last question.
Is that, well, you want to speak on that, Mark?
No.
Yeah. So we haven't looked at that particular part at all, to be frank. So we have our free surfer segmentation sort of works, but it still has lots of problems. Too many problem is that we want to counter check all the delineations that are basically sort of like put in there from FS average essentially. So we're still fighting at many levels on the segmentation in temporal lobe, where your eye just sees, no, this is wrong, but we're just struggling to get the computer to do it right, because the moment we do a free surface segmentation again, or like MRS fix, for example, takes like 6 days, and yeah, it's a project, but so I can't tell you very much. So how accurate these delineations from free surfer are.
So I think I was not specific enough. So I mean, like just the ribbon, like the boundaries of the gray matter ribbon, except temporal lobe, or maybe where you have more susceptibility in the free surfer map. Just like, okay, but you will. It's
pretty good for the most part. Okay. It's pretty good for the most part, and there are some places where it's spectacularly wrong.
Like, thank you so much. It's very impressive. Thank you.
Work in progress. We'll hear more on that in the future, it sounds like.
Well, the big difference is I think is like if you kind of like segmenting like a 1 millimeter data set, and you see where free surfer goes wrong or might go wrong, you're kind of looking at the images and you kind of see like, okay, I can see why it's struggling there. I mean, I can barely tell what's right. That's actually not what we have. So our problem is, so like it's just like, why is it wrong here? What's going on? Yeah.
I think Rosanna had a question. Did you still have it, Rosanna?
You can maybe, because I can probably talk to you guys another time. So maybe go to Jordan next.
I was going to do Jordan real quick, and then we can bounce between. So I'll read Jordan.
I'll hide the chat, actually. Sorry. I forgot I'm still screen sharing.
Oh, I couldn't see your chat, but so Jordan asked, how do you deal with or think about variability between subjects? And in parentheses was especially differences in gyrification patterns.
Well, this is one of my favorite questions, because it was one of those moments where I had an aha moment myself in George's lab when I got brought in. And so, every student and anyone who sort of understands even otherwise a lot of the different MRI work, as Mark's pointed out, focuses a lot on averages, right? For good, for a very valid reason. You want it to be the most representative of the population. And so Mark and I know someone who's doing, I think it's 1,000 brains in one, all averaged together from different participants. And that person's going to have a very good generic representation of the person, but it's within the variability that we see the detail. And so you could have 1,000 brains be very representative of the population, but averaging 1,000 different brains that are all slightly different by a few millimeters washes them all out. And so you'll get a beautiful detail and clarity on broader structures, macro structures, and some of the even medium-sized ones. But within the minutiae of the thalamus and the minutiae of the hippocampus, you're going to lose it all if you start averaging across, because even a shift of 0.5 millimeter, like I already showed, you're going to lose a bit of detail there. And so by having only 1 or 2 brains that are individually, mind you, delineated, you've realistically only delineating 1 brain that's been averaged itself so many times to get its detail up. You get to see these small, very microscopic changes within the structures that then amplify and become rather significant as you sort of keep layering an average of the same person over and over. So it's actually, variability is what we want, because we're not looking for it to necessarily be the most representative of the human population. We're looking at it to be the most detailed of the human brain. And we hope and presume that Mark's brain, which is what we're seeing here, has all the different components that everyone has. We're hoping he's not missing something we are, or he's got something more that we don't. I hope that answers your question, Jordan.
I'll do, Jordan says thanks. So yes, I'll take the thanks as an assumption that yes, that was answered. And then Ty Wishart said, really nice resource with the T1 or DWI or DEC image. Do you anticipate expanding the atlas to include fiber pathway tracking?
Yep.
Yeah, we do. So look, I mean, this is, you know, the amount of different things we can do from here on is staggering. And we're doing many of them. But obviously this is also where it sort of comes, but fiber pathways is probably a very, very big one, a very important one. One that we're struggling a little bit at the moment, because it's difficult, but it's also fascinating and important. So yeah, this is something that we're working on. But the other thing that we sort of like, it's just one of the many things that we can do. And that's sort of also where we kind of want your feedback, is sort of like where it sort of comes, sort of what is most important sort of for you guys to kind of, you know, because time is precious. But as the other bit is also we're sort of ready for collaborations. So if someone says like, oh, this is lovely, I want to do fiber tracking in there. Can we work together? Well, you're just running through open doors here. Yeah.
Great. All right, Rosanna, I'm gonna have you answer or ask your question, but I'll say that there are also enthusiastic thanks from people who had to hop off. So just so that you know that those who are trickling out were very enthusiastic, and Valerie, who's on the steering committee, said she's looking forward to connecting more in the future. So, but that I'm going to say, Rosanna, I'll have you go now, but I wanted to not let that go unsaid while I wasn't recording.
Sure. So thanks so much. This has really been an excellent talk, and it's really shown the beautiful marriage between the MRI world and the postmortem histology, neuroanatomical world, how you guys have just come together in this beautiful marriage and created a beautiful baby out of it. So congratulations on that. I have so many questions for you, but one maybe question that might be relevant to people in the audience would be, after you've generated this amazing resource, Steve, are there plans to make this into an atlas that is available for example, for MNI space? So for somebody to download a high resolution brain along with the atlas labels that you very carefully delineated, so that people can use it for their imaging analyses.
Absolutely, and not to be a stickler, Rosanna, but you said that I just want to make sure, Mark, it is Mark and George as well. As much as I like to talk about it, they contributed. I just need to make sure that was clarified. But yes, absolutely, we'd love to. Sort of like how Mark said, and I think it's going to be a common answer from us is yes, we'd like to, with all the suggestions. And so principally, yes, to be able to download the delineations with the data set in that general sense. Yes, that is the goal. In fact, that's how we'd like the atlas finalized to be published, is online with free access. Well, presumably free atlas, who knows how the universe goes, but free access with the delineations. And I'll let Mark speak on it just in case I'm not as articulate, but presumably, yes, also we'd like to be able to put it in an MNI space or something similar so that people can have sort of a stereotaxic way to go through.
Yeah, look, MNI space is obviously a big one. The thing is, there is different spaces are sort of like transferable, and the same sort of like with MNI space, right? So they're essentially just a coordinate transform for the most part. So once, so what we sort of have is transformable essentially in any different space. We're happy to kind of sort of do that and provide that. It's for us, working in MNI space is not useful at this stage, at least. So and also it's, well, it isn't even one MNI space, right? There are several of them, for crying out loud, and I find that highly frustrating. If it was just a single MNI space, I probably would have transformed it into that one and used that one. But since it isn't, I decided not to. But obviously, if someone says like, I want this like super high resolution image in this specific MNI space, talk to me and I can do that, or into any other space. At this moment, the paper delineations, the way George and Steve are doing them right now, I can't transform them, right? Not easily. But the other thing that's like going on in my head as things to do, and let's just kind of hope I wake up at 3 a.m. at night and the epiphany comes into me how to do it, is to transform them into like a 3D type volume that I can then shoot through any type of transformations. And it's a big problem. It's one I'm pretty confident I will solve. But I don't have it right now, so I can't transform these delineations in any other space at the moment. But if someone says, if that epiphany is not coming to me at 3 a.m. at night, but someone calls me on the phone or writes me an email, I'm fine with that epiphany too.
As everyone can see, I hope, we're obsequious to the community. We enjoy this work and we want to make this atlas, but ideally we do it at the service of the community. So the community says, nope, Dr. Kassem, we need it like this for us to use it. Okay, yes, sir, we'll bring it to you in that way if we can. Because that's our goal. I mean, we can make these maps, but if no one uses them, then what's the point, right? I mean, outside of their beauty and the joy we get from them, that's not enough. We're greedy. We want also people to use them.
Jordan put in a vote for using surface-based registration, so you might consider
that's where FreeSurfer comes in the game, yes. But it has its limits, right? It's surface. This is cortex. I mean, lots of the things that we're talking about here are subcortical. So that's not just
he might be referring to surface-based even for hippocampus, because Jordan's done some work on flattening of the unraveling the hippocampus. So.
Right. That's new. That's a new approach to me. It sort of makes sense to me. I can imagine. So, but yeah. Okay. Cool. Sounds awesome.
There's Jordan. Jordan, I hope I don't mischaracterize how you. I know it's not a simple unrolling, but
no, that was perfect. That was perfect. Yeah, I just I guess this is a hippocampal subfields piece of trivia. I think that they posted as well that the hippocampus is not subcortical; it's archicortical.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
And you can unroll it just like the neocortex.
Yep.
Flatten it out.
Yes.
Well, your thalamus is also beautiful, which I know Vinod is also interested in, and the detail, especially combining the T2 and the T1 for the thalamus, looks like it could be real game changer.
Yeah, that's really true. I just wrote a message to Mark that I would love to do some collaboration.
Fantastic.
Yeah, shoot me an email, and I'm happy to continue this conversation. Totally. And if someone tells me they would be happy to do flat maps of the hippocampus, I'm all game. Yeah.
Cool.
I would like to try such a thing. We'll get in contact.
Awesome. This is why we're here at 7 a.m. in the morning, or actually 8.
I was going to say, look at that. Beautiful. It worked out. Me asking Mark where his picnic was before everyone came on, because I just have no chill when it's 7 a.m. their time. He's like, what are you talking about?
Put this one here to make Kelsey happy.
It's in Germany, it's at 12 o'clock in the night now.
I know, they're even worse. And I'm half jet lagged and half hanging in Germany time. I just came back to Australia like a week ago. No, it's all good.
The things Zoom makes possible though, yeah?
Absolutely.
One of the perks of it. I am thinking I should at least wrap up for the recording bit, but I just want to reiterate that I'm so glad that you guys came. You're so amenable, and it's very clear like that there's interest on both sides to work together, to collaborate and try to progress, for everyone's advantage. And you know, as you and especially Steve cheerlead this atlas with great vigor, which it's very much worthwhile. I'm glad that we'll have this as a resource, and that I hope that when we send out that survey, you'll be able to get even more information to sort of help, and we can, you know, have additional, you know, conversations like you talked about with the unfolding with Jordan and whatnot. But we'll make sure that we have this video out for those of you who couldn't make it at this time, because it's past 12 or it's earlier than 7. Time zones are a fun thing, so that we can make sure that we have this nice communication that we can keep going. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop my recording, but I'm going to thank everyone for joining us again, and we'll see you in just 2 weeks at our normal time for a developmental session, which I hate to inform you will not be at the same resolution, but it will still be with kiddos, which is my bread and butter. So I hope that we'll still have some star emojis, although this is going to be a very tough act to follow. All right. Thank you, everyone, so much.